Someone who goes by the name of Laurie has left a question on my previous video. The previous video dealt with what I call the human animal, which is 99.999% recurring of the human race. In fact, it doesn't matter who you are, we all have that animal within us, the creature that desires to survive, just as every other animal desires to survive and will do whatever is necessary within its power to do that. In human beings, that desire becomes perverted. So instead of a person being happy to survive on what is really just necessary for existence, they might decide they want to acquire a couple of $1 billion. It's a mental illness in actual fact, and has been treated as such in previous generations. But these days we seem to put those people on a pedestal. Anyway, that's a human animal. Something that is driven by its need to survive. And in the process of surviving, or making efforts to survive, experiences all kinds of passions or emotions. Many of them what we traditionally call negative: hatred, fear, greed, envy, a long list of them. A human being, on the other hand, is capable of operating from reason to some extent. So reason would say it's a good idea that we don't raid each other's homes and steal whatever is valuable in there, because life would become chaotic and totally unlivable. And so we do have some level of reason, but the reason is embedded in laws. And most people obey laws because the punishment is perceived to be greater than the possible reward they might get. Not dissimilar from Christians who decide that they're going to do good works in this life so they can avoid punishment in the next life. So that's a human being. If a human being can operate according to reason and be a reasonable person, then such a person will know that it's in the benefit of humanity as a whole to cooperate. But actually there are very few people like that. In reality, when you get down to the bottom of it, you only have to have a look at someone selling a car or a home. They will, if possible, usually try and extract as much as possible from the person who's buying. It's an animal kind of behavior in truth, although we see it as being perfectly normal. Anyway, the previous video, I'm trying to think of the name of it. I think it was called "You May Never Have Known a Human Being." It goes into that in some depth. So the question that's being asked is, what about the illuminated person? Of course, we're interested in knowing about the illuminated person because if you read all the books, the illuminated person supposedly is free from pain. And it's an attractive proposition. Somehow we can do things or work in a certain way that results in us becoming, to use that awful word, enlightened or awakened, where we become maybe happy, joyful, and impervious to pain. Well, in my experience, it really isn't like that. And of course, my experience may be not correct. I can only offer what is my experience, and you make of it whatever you will. Spinoza, in his Ethics, says, "He who clearly and distinctly understands himself and his emotions loves God." Now, isn't that a strange thing to say? And by the way, for Spinoza, God is not some anthropomorphic entity with emotions and the kind of thoughts that we might have. God is, well, maybe the nearest thing to think of is existence. So you could then read that as, "He who clearly and distinctly understands himself and his emotions loves existence." Now, the question as always is, how do we end up there? Well, Spinoza has said what we need to do in that fairly short extract there. But I'll just read a sentence from, or a few sentences from, a book called Zen and the Psychology of Transformation by Hubert Benoit, who worked with both Gurdjieff and studied Spinoza. It's a wonderful book. If you want to dismiss all your imaginations that you might have had about enlightenment or awakening, then this is a good book to read. And it says, "To the question, 'What must I do to free myself?' Zen replies, 'There is nothing you need do, since you have never been enslaved, and since there is nothing in reality from which you can free yourself.'" Typical Zen statement. Happens to be true, although I'm not exactly sure how much it helps people. Well, I guess it helps people in that maybe they might perceive that awakening, or whatever you want to call it, isn't a result of doing a whole pile of stuff. You're actually already there, but you don't know it. And the reason you don't know it, coming back to Spinoza, is because you do not clearly and distinctly understand yourself and your emotions. The emotions, or the passions, are like a fog. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated these emotions are. So one of your emotions might be the desire to, the need, the energy you put into awakening, a feeling of dissatisfaction. That might be one of the emotions. But even that is part of the fog. And of course, while you are wandering around in the fog, then you can't really see anything. So, as various traditions say, and Zen probably more than most of them, it's not about adding to your repertoire of ideas. It's really about dissolving them so that you're left with your own being. A person who's awakened to some extent, as you will find in all the literature, finds it very hard to talk about it because it's very ordinary. There's nothing that resembles what you might read in some of the literature of cosmic consciousness or becoming aware of extra dimensions or whatever other nonsense you might read about it. All that happens is that you become yourself without all the baggage. So Spinoza's innocent-looking statement that he who clearly and distinctly understands himself and his emotions loves God is a recipe for a great deal of work to do precisely that, to understand yourself and your emotions. All the great sages have said, know thyself. Of course, these days the word understand and know have been degraded in meaning. Very often we think that to understand means to have some kind of mental process where we effectively play around with concepts and reach some kind of conclusion. Well, not so. Understanding is something that goes right down into the guts of your being. And this is sort of similar to the way the Buddhists view the lotus flower. The lotus flower grows out of the grime and the mud at the bottom of the pond or the lake. It sucks nutrient from there, or it is a flowering from that. So that's where you have to go. Down into the muck and grime of your being. And you have to go there with consciousness. You have to see it. In the Gurdjieff tradition it would be called self-observation. Self-observation is not easy. It takes years to become proficient or master, because our natural inclination is to try and change what we see, or to move away from it, to avoid it, to judge it. And that is the ego trying to defend its territory. So what is it like to be awakened? It's a number of things. One of the things you don't hear talked about very often is to have a new level of courage. Because you're still in a body. Your body, if a lion comes charging at your body will become frightened. But will that thing at the center of you become frightened? Well, no, because it has a new kind of courage. So we find a new kind of courage. We also find that what is perfectly fine. That there's far less, well, ideally no discrimination. All of these things take years to understand, because we are all filled with various biases and ideas of how things should be. We believe that the universe needs to conform to our ideas of what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is truthful, what is not truthful. It was very often said of Gurdjieff and many other sages that people never knew whether they were good or bad people. It shatters the idea of the sage being some saintly figure. The sage is not a saintly figure. Even the Tao Te Ching says the sage views all creatures as straw dogs. Straw dogs are used in China during a ceremony as a replacement for real animals in a sacrifice, and once they're used, they're either burned up or just thrown away. So, the most pressing need is to see reality. And again, Gurdjieff said, a man who sees reality before he is ready will go insane. So the stakes are very high. Personally, I would recommend most people to stay in their sleep. Not exactly what, I suppose, is the popular wisdom. Because again, Gurdjieff said, blessed is the man who has no soul, and blessed is the man who has a soul, but pain and grief to the man who has one in the making. And that's about the reality of it. So if you are hell-bent on a spiritual quest, then you need to bear those things in mind. What awaits you at the end of it, if you arrive there, is exactly what you've got now. But without the search, and without the dissatisfaction. In other words, with contentment and peace. Nothing else changes. Anyway, I hope that's been useful.